And my time was running wild, a million dead-end streets, and every time I thought I got it made, it seemed the taste was not so sweet.
If you asked someone to describe 1960s America to you, you'd probably hear the word change tossed around a lot. These years kicked off a revolution felt all the way through the 1970s, with effects still lasting here in 2018. A raging against a stagnant U.S. caused an explosion of new ideas in entertainment, values, and most drastically, politics. The ever-tumultuous decade opens with an election, the conservative Richard Nixon versus the liberal John F. Kennedy, and continued with the rise of counterculture, mainly protesting the American involvement in the Vietnam War, mostly led by young people in favor of change. The women's rights movement, demanding equal rights for the sexes and liberation of women, also had its place on the political stage of the time, and allowed women more personal freedoms overall. But, arguably, the most prominent struggle in the 1960s was the civil rights movement, establishing its influence during the 50s and continuing until the early 70s. From its founding, the United States had been plagued with racism and the mistreatment of minorities, even enacting laws from the segregation of the races in public places, including schools. Daily experiences of racism from the accounts of people of color were commonplace. It seemed as though prejudice was always going to be woven into the fabric of American society. There had always been the opposition, but it took the power of the 60s to really create change. It took civil rights leaders such as Reverend Martin Luther King and many others. These leaders were integral to the success of the movement, but it really could not have been done without the students of America who let their voices be heard. SNCC, CORE, and other student organizations coordinated nationwide protests, with sit-ins becoming their trademark. Sit-ins were demonstrated by black participants sitting in a whites-only section of a public place and waiting to be served. They were not. They were, however, met with relentless violence and aggression. There happened to be a real danger in standing up for what you believed in. Among these valiant students were leaders such as John Lewis, Diane Nash, and Stokely Carmichael. Some of the first sit-ins began in Greensboro, North Carolina. Inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's idea of civil disobedience, 4 students walked into a Woolworth and asked to be seated. Their impact changed the civil rights movement forever. A number of similar sit-ins were set into motion throughout the South, including in Atlanta, Georgia.
As U.S. citizens reacted to the Greensboro sit-ins, so did local governments, including Georgia's. In February of 1960, Georgia state legislature deemed the act of refusing to leave an establishment a misdemeanor, indirectly criminalizing student sit-ins. However, that did not stop the actions of a passionate Morehouse College student, Lonnie C. King. King, along with his colleagues, namely Julian Bond, Herschel Sullivan, Carolyn Long, Joseph Pierce, and others, introduced the idea of sit-ins to their fellow students and began recruiting participants to help their cause. After meeting with like-minded young leaders from other black colleges in the area, they formed the renowned Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, or COAHR. Collectively, the minds of the organization eloquently formed their declaration to America titled An Appeal for Human Rights. The work was featured in countless media publications, including a full ad in the New York Times and Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But attention does not always mean admiration. Georgia Governor Ernest Van Diver had this to say about it.
This left-wing statement is calculated to breed dissatisfaction, discontent, discord, and evil.
Atlanta Mayor William B. Hartsfield also had an opinion on the matter. As many politicians of his time, Hartsfield had a more accepting tone, but took no action upon his own accord.
We have at least tried to be of goodwill towards all our citizens, to preserve an atmosphere of harmony, and when we move, to move in the right direction.
Without the actions of the passionate, it is unlikely Atlanta would be the place it is today. Demonstrations began on March 15th of 1960 with students at 10 different lunch counters across the city. Of the 200 protesters, 77 were arrested, though none were injured. Just as they started, protests were called off for the next day. COAHR had already been met with negotiation offers from local businesses. They were, however, short-sighted and unlikely to bring about a compromise. So the protests continued. On May 14th, a march scheduled at the state capitol building brought the first real signs of danger to the Atlanta movement. State troopers, dogs, and opposers loomed around the area, bringing fears of violence with them. City police could do nothing to help the demonstrators except divert them. The march never reached the Capitol building. Traction picked up back again in the fall with the arrival of a new semester, heat from a Ku Klux Klan rally from earlier in the year, and a nationwide election. Plans for a boycott of the richest department store chain and a new COAHR newsletter began the school year with a renewed vigor in the fight for human rights. Close down your account with segregation. Open up your account with freedom. The tagline for the new campaign rang from the hearts of the passionate. It was during this period that some of the most iconic moments of the Atlanta civil rights movement occurred. On October 19th, after careful deliberation and groundwork, a mass onslaught of demonstrations were put forth onto Atlanta streets. With help from a visiting and recently formed SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and Martin Luther King Jr., a series of sit-ins and pickets of downtown department stores such as Rich's and Woolworth's occurred. Counter-protests from the Ku Klux Klan brought even more attention. 52 protesters, including Dr. King, were arrested. King's arrest sparked outrage and power to the movement. A county jail ruled his arrest was in violation of a probation from a driving offense, ultimately sending him to prison. Attendance soared after mass outrage. This, coupled with intervention by President-elect Kennedy, King was released. Atlanta Mayor William Hartsfield also called for the release of 22 protesters in jails and a calm period for negotiations to take place. Demonstrations were halted. Once again, they failed. Business leaders remained adamant in their stance against desegregation.
The next round of protests pressed on with resilience. Those arrested refused bail to crowd the city jails. Business leaders began closing their lunch counters to thwart demonstrators from even trying to stage sit-ins. In response, the students assigned someone to call them immediately after the counters reopened. With both sides deeply rooted in their convictions, this seemingly endless charade continued over the course of a few months. But the title of this piece is Conflict and Compromise, and eventually both sides reached an agreement, although not completely happy with the outcome. On March 7th of 1961, city leaders, black and white, decided to desegregate the public facilities of Atlanta in the upcoming fall, after an obvious decline in profit of affected businesses. It felt like a stab in the back to organizers like Lonnie King, as they spent years of their lives working for a cause they were passionate about, and were left out of the deliberation process. An appeal for human rights even stressed an immediate freedom. We do not intend to wait placidly for those rights that are already legally and morally ours. At later meetings of student leaders, these concerns were voiced quite blatantly. Just as Lonnie King, they felt betrayed by the older leaders of their community and felt as though their voices weren't the ones that were heard. This infighting might have been the downfall of the recent agreement, but the voice of Martin Luther King Jr. brought tension down. If anyone breaks this agreement, he proclaimed, let it be the white man. The students were not the only ones let down by the agreement. Segregationist groups like the Ku Klux Klan and Guts, Georgians and Willing to Surrender, felt as though they were double-crossed. Lester Maddox, leader of Guts and future governor of Georgia, was especially unhappy. Why are civil rights more important than human rights, he argued, referring to business owners' rights. But by the fall, it seemed as though his anger was short-sighted. Although it was never formally broken, the agreement was basically ignored by businesses, afraid of how their white customers would react. Complete desegregation seemed to be years away. The struggle for human rights has never been a necessarily easy one. From the fight to end slavery to the fight some individuals are in today, there will always ultimately be a compromise. Freedom fighters are up against entire systems, entire ways of life, two things very resistant to change, which is discouraging. The never-wavering resilience they display is near impossible, yet we see it time after time again. Leaders like John Lewis and Lonnie King continued through some of the most turbulent times in American history and are still dedicating their lives to causes they believe in. It might be hard to change the world, but it is even harder to break the human spirit.